Hi guys, it's Donna from talkfeelchange.com, and today I'm going to be speaking about a theoretical structure called Transactional Analysis, or TA for short. And it's a way of understanding how we relate to other people and how we communicate with them. And I'm hoping that by understanding this, you will be able to gain insight into how you communicate and relate to everyone in your life, from your best friend to your family, your colleagues at work, and your romantic partners. And hopefully this will help you to improve on those ways that you relate and help you to lead a happier life. I use TA quite a lot when I'm working with my clients in therapy sessions, and I also use it quite a bit in my own life. And I found it really helpful, so I hope that you'll also gain some insight from this. Okay, so have you ever noticed that being around certain people automatically brings out different aspects of yourself? Some aspects you might really like, and others you might not like very much. But being around those people seems to always bring that out. You may find that being around a certain person, you kind of just lose all your confidence pretty much every time you're around them, and you're not even sure why. Or if you're around someone and you just lose your ability to set boundaries, which you might be a lot better at with other people, and you find yourself constantly agreeing to things that you actually don't really want to be doing. Or you are constantly apologizing to someone for things that actually aren't even really your faults. If you've ever experienced something like this, then TA might help you to change some of those dynamics. Okay, so TA is a theoretical structure by Eric Berne, and it's based on the understanding that our actions are not so much based on another person's behavior, but it's more based on our own state of mind. In transactional analysis, we analyze our transactions, and our transactions are our interactions with other people. So we analyze how we interact or transact with other people. And this is based on the understanding that we have three main ego states. Our three ego states are parent, adult, and child. And basically, we are constantly, throughout our lives, shifting between all three of these ego states. And I'm going to explain each different ego state, and then I will illustrate this with some examples. So just bear with me. The first ego state that I'm going to speak about is the parent ego state. And when we are in this ego state, we think and feel and act in a way that was influenced by how our parents or our main caregiver was when we were in our childhood. So it's a sort of taught behavior. Okay, so the parent ego state can be subdivided into two very broad types of parent. And the first one is the critical or the controlling parent, who would sort of try to control others and get them to behave in a way that they think others should behave. And then we also have the nurturing parent ego state, which is when we feel very loving and protective and really wanting to help others, maybe to a point of not really seeing others as super competent, but really wanting to nurture and take care of others. Okay, so that was the parent ego state. The second ego state is the child. The child ego state is also divided, and on one side we have the adaptive and cooperative child, who pretty much obeys authority figures and might be a bit more shy and is quite obedient in general. And then on the other side we have the spontaneous and the free child, who is a lot less reserved and will sort of do and say more of what they want and how they feel, and might also be a bit more reckless. Okay, and then thirdly we have the adult state. Now this state is quite different from the other two because it's not subdivided, and it's also not pre-programmed based on authority figures during our childhood. When we're in the adult state, we look at each situation in the here and now, each situation as it happens, and we respond to each situation with maturity and respect and compromise. Okay, so briefly, those are the three different ego states. And it's really important that you understand that none of these ego states is necessarily better than any other one. So for example, while the adaptive child might be really good with something like self-discipline, the creative child really helps us with things like creativity and spontaneity. So none of them are necessarily have any intrinsic value that is better than any of the others. That being said, transactional analysis does encourage us to use our adult state and rely on our adult states more in our lives. And you'll start to understand why once I start showing you through some examples. If you identified with any of the situations that I spoke about at the beginning, like struggling to say no to someone or constantly apologizing to them, it's very possible that in those situations, you weren't actually in your adult state. Okay, so let me clarify by using some examples and relating them to these different ego states. So let's look at the example of Luke and Max. Luke says, I've got a work function tomorrow night and I can't go by myself. I just get so intimidated by some of my colleagues. I need you there with me. Well, I have a full day tomorrow and I'll probably be really tired. But yeah, sure, I'll go with you. Thanks, Max. Come over to my place first. I just know I'll feel so much better if we arrive together. Okay, I'll come around 6. Okay, so in this situation, we can see that Luke was coming from a child state. He was quite needy and quite helpless. And while Max may have initially been in an adult state, hearing Luke in the child state may have caused him to respond from a nurturing parent state. Max probably reacts more from a nurturing parent ego state than a controlling one, because his primary caregiver was probably more nurturing than critical during his childhood. Like I said before, none of these ego states are necessarily good or bad in and of themselves. If we look at the situation in isolation, it is totally fine to go out of your way for a friend who feels that they need you. But we often set up certain patterns with people in our lives where we sort of lock ourselves into that pattern, where one person may often act as the nurturing parent and the other person will often act as the child in that relationship. And when these patterns become very fixed and they often play out with the same people, it could have a negative impact. So for example, if Luke is always feeling like the child and Max is always feeling like more of a parent, this might have a negative impact on their friendship, because Max might want to stop seeing Luke because he always has to go out of his way for Luke and be there for Luke, and it's not necessarily reciprocated. Okay, and let's look at the arrows between Max and Luke. We can see that they are aligned. And when arrows are aligned like this, they are called complementary transactions. Now, most of the transactions in our lives are actually complementary transactions, because if someone's going to approach you from the child state, you're probably going to respond from the parent state and vice versa. But TA encourages us to respond from an adult state. So let's see what could have happened with Max and Luke if Max had actually responded from the adult state. I've got a work function tomorrow night and I can't go by myself. I just get so intimidated by some of my colleagues. I need you to go there with me. I know work functions can be daunting, but I have a full day tomorrow and I'm afraid I just can't make it. I really can't go alone though. You have to come with me. I'm sorry, Luke. I want to be a good friend, but I've got a lot on my plate at the moment, and I know you will be okay by yourself. You go to work with them every day. How about you give me a call on your way to the function and I'll give you a little pep talk? Yeah, that would be okay. Thanks, mate. Did you see what happened to the arrows in that example? They stopped being aligned, they stopped being complementary, and they crossed. And so in that case, at that point, it's called a crossed interaction. Because we have so many complementary transactions happening with people all the time, we actually end up expecting them to carry out, because complementary transactions are very stable and they often play out again and again and again and again in relationships. So for example, it would be very reasonable for Luke to expect Max to help him, because in their friendship, in their relationship, Luke probably is often in the child state and he is often requiring Max to go out of his way to help him. And Max is probably often in the parent state and is going out of his way to help Luke. So it's quite reasonable for him to expect that to continue happening. But as we can see, a crossed transaction is very different. So a crossed transaction is like a sudden turning point where someone shifts their ego state and it might not be what the other person was expecting. So here, Luke was expecting Max to respond from the parent state, and instead he responded from the adult state. And this caused the cross transaction. Usually a cross transaction will lead to a shift in the other person's ego state so that they can continue forming a new complementary transaction. So let's look at another example. Here we have Ruth and Dylan. Ruth says, "Is that report ready?" "No, get off my case." "Look, you can't just make up your own deadlines around here. I want it on my desk by 3 p.m. Okay, in this case, Ruth may have approached Dylan from the adult state and she just asked him if the report was ready. Dylan responded from the child state, and so that caused a crossed transaction. And like we just discussed, often a cross transaction will lead to a shift in the other person's ego state so that they form a new complementary transaction. And that's exactly what happened here. Ruth then moved from the adult to the parent ego state, forming this new complementary transaction. And as we also discussed, a lot of the complementary transactions between people are quite stable and they will play out again and again. And having an adult-child transaction in like a workplace wouldn't be very helpful for people like Ruth and Dylan. So we can see how bringing in more of the adult state would be very helpful for both of them. Okay, so for instance, Dylan could have replied from the adult state saying, "Look, Ruth, I hoped it would be ready and I've been working on it tirelessly and I want it to be good quality. So would it be at all possible for me to give it to you by the end of the day?" It's much easier for Ruth to continue responding in the adult state if he says something like that from the adult state, because it's so much more mature and reasonable. We can also look at this example in another way. Even if Dylan had responded from the child position, Ruth could have refused to play into this and refused to form that complementary transaction. And she could have not responded as a parent, but responded as an adult, saying, "Look, Dylan, I know it's a lot of work, maybe even more than you estimated. But in the future, if you need more time, please just let me know in advance and then I can adjust my work accordingly." And of course, Dylan could respond to that in the child position, but it's harder for him to do so when Ruth is being so reasonable, so respectful, and she's treating him like an adult. Okay, so that is a brief outline of transactional analysis. And while my examples were a bit simplified, I really hope that it helped you to really understand the different ego states and how they work. And I hope that you can use this framework in your own life and help you to notice when you're relating to someone maybe as a child or when they're relating to you as a critical parent. And I hope that you can use that in your own life and bring in more of an adult response and improve some of the relations in your life. And if you're interested in analyzing a more complicated conversation in a bit more detail, check out my next vlog where I explain how I would use transactional analysis in a couples therapy session. Okay, cheers for now.